On July 8th, 2026, StatCounter published its June 2026 desktop operating system market share data. And within hours, the number was everywhere. In Linux forums, in tech subreddits, in Discord servers, in Mastodon threads. Windows, 56, 55%. For the first time in the history of StatCounter's dataset, Windows desktop market share had dropped below 60%. The operating system that has sat above 70% for most of its history, that has defined personal computing for 30 years, that has survived every challenger from OS2 to BOS to Google Chrome OS, was sitting at 56, 55%, and Linux, in the same report, was at 4, 39%, one of its strongest showings ever recorded. The celebration started immediately. The skepticism followed almost as fast. And because this channel tries to give you the full picture, rather than the most exciting version, this video is both the celebration and the skepticism, because both are warranted by the data, and because understanding what this number actually means is more useful than either uncritical excitement or reflexive dismissal. Bill Gates is not shocked. He has not been involved in Microsoft's day-to-day for years. Windows has not collapsed. It is still the dominant desktop operating system by a substantial margin. And the specific reason Windows dropped below 60% is more complicated than any headline has fully explained. But the underlying trend those numbers reflect is real. And the record Linux is breaking in gaming is a different number that is less ambiguous and more consequential for the future of Windows gaming. Let us go through all of it. StatCounter's June 2026 data puts Windows at 56, 55% worldwide, while Linux reaches 4, 39%. StatCounter's numbers should be read for what they are: web usage statistics, not a direct count of installed operating systems. The company calculates its global stats from page views across websites using its tracking code, analyzing details such as browser, operating system, and screen resolution. In other words, the figures reflect measured web activity rather than the number of machines actually installed worldwide. This distinction, web activity versus installed base, is critical and too often buried in the second paragraph of coverage that leads with the dramatic number. StatCounter does not count computers. It counts web page views that its tracking code observes and identifies the operating system from the user agent string that browsers send with each request. If you visit a website that uses StatCounter analytics and your browser reports that you are running Linux, you are counted as a Linux user for that visit. This methodology has real advantages. It measures active use rather than stale install counts, and real limitations that the June 2026 data makes unusually visible. The unknown category disappeared entirely in the CSV version of the data. The percentages are recalculated using only devices whose operating systems could actually be identified. After removing the unknown traffic, Windows doesn't sit at 56, 61%. It climbs back to approximately 72%. The unknown category. This is the variable that the 55% headline did not explain. According to recent figures, it has already increased to roughly 67% during July 2026. Nearly a quarter of all traffic in StatCounter's June dataset came from devices whose operating systems could not be identified. That is not Linux, that is not Mac OS. That is browsers, AI agents, VPN tools, and privacy extensions that are sending user agent strings that StatCounter cannot classify into a known OS category. The unknown category climbed from 8% in October 2025 to 75% by June 2026. Most of that apparent drop is a measurement artifact, an 75% unknown category driven by privacy tools that mask OS fingerprints, not a real fall in Windows use. One of the most upvoted replies argued that a 7-point drop for Windows in a single month is a stretch, and that a pile of unclassified bot traffic is a much simpler explanation than a mass exodus. That upvoted reply is correct. A 7-point single-month drop in Windows market share would be extraordinary, the largest single-month shift in the history of desktop operating system market share measurement. The more likely explanation is that the unknown category is absorbing traffic that would previously have been classified as Windows, inflating the apparent Windows decline. StatCounter's own FAQ notes that statistics remain subject to revision for up to 45 days, meaning current monthly numbers can still change as additional data is processed. So the accurate reading of the June 2026 StatCounter data, Windows has been declining, but 55% is the number that includes a large unknown bucket that was much smaller before. Without the unknown category, which Tech2Geek's analysis confirmed literally 4 hours ago as of this recording, Windows sits at approximately 72% of identified traffic. Having walked back the most dramatic reading of the number, let me now make the case for why the underlying trend is still significant. The long-term trend is still clear. Windows remains the dominant desktop operating system, but its share is gradually declining as macOS gains momentum, Linux continues its steady growth, and an increasing amount of web traffic becomes harder to classify. Even excluding the unknown category artifact, the directional movement is documented and consistent. Windows was at 68% in March 2025. It is at approximately 72% of identified traffic in June 2026, but the denominator is now smaller because 67% of traffic cannot be classified. The absolute number of Windows page views has not grown at the rate that internet usage has grown. Whether that reflects users switching away or users using Windows less actively is a question the data alone cannot answer. Windows held 16% of the global desktop OS market in June 2026, down from 71. 68% in March 2025, based on StatCounter traffic data, including the unknown category. That's a decline of roughly 5 percentage points over 12 months. It's a meaningful drop, but far from the dramatic collapse suggested by many headlines. 5 percentage points over 12 months. That is the honest measure. Not a collapse, a meaningful, sustained directional decline. The Linux side of this is equally nuanced. StatCounter recorded Linux at 99% of the global desktop OS market in April 2026. Windows held 6%, and macOS held 34%. Different methodologies in different months produce numbers ranging from 99% to 39% for Linux in the same general period. The range is not random. It reflects the methodological differences between StatCounter's different counting approaches and the timing of when measurement is taken. The number that is methodologically cleaner than StatCounter's web traffic data is the Steam hardware survey. Steam directly queries the operating systems of users who have Steam running. It is not inferring from browser headers, it is asking the operating system directly. The March 2026 Steam hardware survey puts Linux at 33% of Steam users, the highest ever recorded. This marks the first time Linux has crossed the 5% threshold in Steam's data. Steam Deck users made up roughly 42% of Linux gamers on Steam 2 years ago. By March 2026, that dropped to roughly 24%, indicating that organic desktop Linux gaming adoption is growing beyond just handheld users. 33% of Steam users on Linux. And critically, that number is not explained by Steam Deck purchases. Steam Deck users are now a minority of Linux Steam users at 24%. The other 76% of Linux Steam users are on regular desktop and laptop computers that someone deliberately chose to install Linux on. That is the organic desktop Linux gaming adoption figure, and it is growing. The headline of this video refers to Linux breaking records. Let me put those records on the table specifically. Steam Linux gaming at 33% in March 2026 is the highest level ever recorded in Steam's hardware survey history. That is an unambiguous, methodology clean record. Linux desktop market share at approximately 7% globally in 2025. The figure used in multiple analyses before the June StatCounter data complicated things with the unknown category represents the strongest desktop share ever measured for Linux. Depending on which methodology you use, the 2026 figures are either continuing that trend or complicating it with measurement artifacts. The US crossing 5% Linux desktop share for the first time in June 2025 was a documented first in the history of the world's largest PC market. India recorded 21% Linux desktop adoption in July 2024, the highest of any major economy and about 4 times the global rate. 21% in India. 1 in 6 Indian desktop computer users on Linux. That is not a niche in India. It is a mainstream platform. The Linux OS market is estimated at $10, $73 billion in 2026. Projections show it reaching $18, $107 billion by 2029 at a 19% annual growth rate. At $10. $73 billion market growing at 19% annually is not the profile of a niche operating system. It is the profile of a platform that is being taken seriously by organizations large enough to pay for it. Of all the Linux records in 2026, the one that matters most for the future of Windows' market position is the Steam gaming number. Not because 33% is a majority, but because of what it says about the argument that kept millions of users on Windows despite frustrations with it. Gaming stopped being an excuse. Valve's own Steam hardware survey put Linux at an all-time high of 33% back in March 2026. Proton now runs the vast majority of Steam's library without needing a native Linux port. For years, the most consistent reason Windows users, who were frustrated with Microsoft's direction, gave for not switching to Linux was My Games. Specifically, the games they bought on Steam, the gaming performance they expected from their GPU, and the certainty that Linux gaming was a compromise compared to Windows gaming. Each of those objections has weakened substantially in the period from 2022 to 2026. Proton's compatibility has expanded to cover approximately 80 to 90% of the top 1,000 Steam titles with gold or better ratings. The benchmark comparisons between Windows and Linux gaming on AMD hardware, where Linux often performs equivalently or better due to lower background service load, have been documented repeatedly. NVIDIA's Linux driver investment, with simultaneous release of Linux and Windows Vulkan beta drivers in 2025 and 2026, has reduced the driver quality gap that previously made NVIDIA on Linux a frustration. 2 years ago, Steam Deck users made up roughly 42% of Linux gamers on Steam. By March 2026, that dropped to roughly 24%, indicating that organic desktop Linux gaming adoption is growing beyond just handheld users. This is the statistic that the Steam gaming headline often misses. If Steam Deck users were 42% of Linux Steam users 2 years ago and are now 24%, that means the non-Steam Deck Linux gaming population has grown dramatically relative to Steam Deck users. People who bought a Steam Deck in 2022 and 2023 are being joined by a growing population of PC gamers who chose to install Linux on their regular desktops and laptops and are gaming on it. This is organic, deliberate adoption by people who decided gaming on Linux was good enough without needing a specialized piece of hardware to make it happen. Windows is still the world's most popular desktop operating system by a large margin. That is the fact that frames everything else. At any reasonable methodology, whether you use the 72% figure for identified traffic, the 62% figure including unknown, or the various country-specific data, Windows holds a dominant majority of the global desktop market. The decline is real and consistent. It is not a collapse. The drivers of Windows decline are documented and spread across multiple causes that do not all point to Linux benefiting equally. macOS is absorbing some Windows share, particularly in professional and creative workflows where Apple Silicon's performance has been competitive. Chrome OS holds a meaningful position in education markets. The unknown category, whatever is causing it, is absorbing traffic that would previously have counted for Windows. Linux is growing, but it is not the sole beneficiary of Windows share reduction. Windows hasn't necessarily collapsed below 60%. Microsoft's desktop dominance is still shrinking. That's a decline of roughly 5 percentage points over 12 months. It's a meaningful drop, but far from the dramatic collapse suggested by many headlines. 5 percentage points over 12 months is meaningful if it continues. If Windows loses 5 points per year for the next 5 years, it will be at approximately 47%, below majority, by 2031. That would be a genuinely historic shift. If the decline flattens or reverses as Microsoft's K2 quality program takes effect and Windows 11's direction improves, the narrative looks different. The honest answer is that the trajectory is documented and the endpoint depends on decisions that have not yet been made by Microsoft, by Linux distributions, by game developers, by governments, and by the millions of individual users who are currently on Windows 10 and deciding what to do before October 2026. October 13th, 2026 is 93 days from today. The consumer ESU for Windows 10 expires. Hundreds of millions of Windows 10 users, including those on hardware that cannot run Windows 11, face their final deadline. Whatever Linux's market share is in November 2026, measured by stat counter, by Steam, by any methodology, it will be the data point that tells us how many of those October 2026 deadline users chose Linux as their path forward. That number will either validate the narrative that October 2026 is the moment Linux finally converted a mass audience, or it will show that the expected migration largely chose Windows 11 upgrades and new hardware purchases instead. The June 2026 data, 56. 55% including unknown, approximately 72% excluding it, Linux at 4. 39% is a snapshot of a transition in progress. The October 2026 snapshot and the November 2026 data that follows it will tell us whether the transition is as large as the trend suggests or smaller than the excitement implies. What is not in dispute? Windows is declining. Linux is growing. Steam gaming on Linux has never been higher. The governments of France, Germany, Denmark, and increasingly the EU as a whole have made policy decisions that favor Linux. The hardware ecosystem for Linux, Lenovo's ThinkPad Linux pricing, System 76, Framework, Tuxedo, has never been more mature. Whether that constitutes Linux breaking all records and Windows collapsing depends on where you set the threshold for those words. Linux has broken its own records. Steam gaming, US share, India's sustained adoption, the EU policy momentum. Windows has declined below 60% in the headline stat counter number, though the real figure is more complicated. Bill Gates is not shocked. But the person at Microsoft whose job is growing Windows market share has seen 3 years of data flowing in one direction and has 93 days until the pressure intensifies. That is the honest picture of where this stands on July 10th, 2026.